Part 2. The 4 hours passed in a flash. The frozen marsh had long since melted, and the warriors were gathered there at the main gate of the village. After the intense battle several days ago, there were precious few of them who had survived the fight in this battle. There were 316 of them in total. Nobody but the warriors would participate in this battle, because Shaziryu had said, "The enemy is few in number, so too many people on our part will just get in the way." That seemed like a logical enough explanation, but that was not all. Zarusu stood some distance ahead of the lizard men and looked on the warriors. Everyone was painted with markings which showed that the ancestors had descended upon them. Their iron will was readily apparent on their faces, and they looked confident of victory. The lizard men around them were cheering their warriors on. Still, he could see quite a few worried-looking people in the crowd. Zarusu strove to keep a nonchalant expression in order to keep his uneasiness from showing on his face. He did not want the other lizard men to know that this battle was essentially a live sacrifice to the King of Death. Indeed, this was a battle that was intended to demonstrate the undead king's power to the lizard men. Its purpose was to thoroughly eradicate the very possibility of rebellion among the lizard men. They had no chance of serving, which meant that the subtext behind Shaziryu's words was so that we can reduce casualties to the minimum. Zarusu looked away from the lizard men, and he turned his keen gaze on the enemy formation. The skeletal army remained where it was. There was no sign of the monster called Cocytus among them. Zarusu doubted that it was a skeleton. As a trusted subordinate of that King of Death, how could he be a mook like that? He must be some being whose strength was apparent at a glance. A loud splashing came from behind the worried Zarusu. "Hey, Zarusu!" And Zenbaru greeted him as casually as always. He was the same person even when he was headed for certain death. Morale's at its peak. Well, it would be nice if it could stay that way when we face that Cocytus fellow. Yup. Oh, is it time? Shaziryu was at the main gate, and all the lizard men's eyes were on the 2 swamp elementals by his side. Crush was not here because she had spent all her mana on summoning the elementals. The drain of that, on top of casting a plethora of long-duration defensive spells on Zarusu, had left her almost immobile. In fact, when they had left their house, Crush had already told him that she would be passing out from using too much mana, and they would never see each other again. Alone now, Zarusu looked towards the place where Crush was. The way she had looked when they had parted made Zarusu feel like he had been stabbed in the heart. "Warriors, let's go!" With a rousing cry, Shaziryu stoked the flames of the lizard men's fighting spirit, and the air was filled with eager tension. He had to think like a warrior again. Zarusu reined in his rampaging thoughts. The lizard men advanced slowly, led by Shaziryu and the 2 swamp elementals. They were leaving the village so it would not be caught up in the fighting. Zarusu and Zenbaru followed behind them. Just then, Zarusu suddenly looked back to the village. There were the broken-down dirt walls, the worried lizard men watching them go, and Zarusu sighed quietly, and cast all his worries away as he strode forward. He did not speak the name of the female which was on his lips. The lizard men marched into the marsh, and formed up the region between the skeletal army and the village. That said, they had no formation to speak of. They simply sprawled themselves out to wait for the fight. At their head were the various tribal chiefs and the 2 swamp elementals. The skeletal army had probably been waiting for their arrival. They banged on their shields and stomped. The many small delays between footfalls would normally make an army's march sound like a shower of bird droppings. However, the undead army marched with perfect coordination, producing a harmonious sound. If the circumstances were any different, it would be worthy of applause. Just as the lizard men were drawn in by the sound of their movements, several trees fell behind the skeletal army. There was only one reason why those gigantic trees would fall: because someone had cut them down. This sparked a commotion among the lizard men. Since nobody was visible yet, it was reasonable to assume that several people had worked together to fell those trees. However, if that were the case, then the trees were falling with far too much uniformity. Granted, after seeing the unity of the skeletal army, an observer might think that they could chop down trees with such precision, but none of the lizard men felt that way. A bizarre thought ran through their minds that all this had been done by one person. That was because there was no sound of blades striking wood before the trees fell. In other words, it might be possible, however surprising it was, that some incredibly strong person had chopped the trees down with one swing. How strong an arm and how mighty a weapon would be need to cut a massive tree in half with a single stroke. The earth-shaking tremors of the falling trees blended with the sound of the skeletons pounding on their shields, and both crept closer to the lizard men. Anxiety began to brew. That was only to be expected. Who could remain calm under such circumstances? Even Zenberu, who was prepared to die, was shaken, though he tried to hide it. Soon, the creature which had cleaved a path through the forest finally appeared. At the same time, the pounding on the shield suddenly stopped. In the preternatural silence, the first thing they saw was a mass of glossy blue light. How much more brightly would it have shone had the sky not been overcast? It looked like a two-legged insect, its massive body standing around 250 centimeters high. It resembled an ant or a mantis, and it looked like some hybrid made by an utterly depraved fiend. Its hard exoskeleton was wreathed in freezing cold, and it glittered like diamond dust. It had a savage tail that was as long as its body and studded with countless spikes. Its mighty jaws looked like they could easily bite a man's hands clean off. It had 4 arms tipped in razor-sharp claws, each of which was sheathed in a shiny gauntlet. It wore a disc-like amulet on a golden necklace and platinum rings around its ankles. This was how the being of matchless might, follower of the King of Death, made its entrance. Was he Cocytus? Zariasu's heart pounded. Unconsciously, his breathing had grown faster. None of the lizard men spoke. Everyone's attention was drawn to the monster that had shown itself, and they were so frightened that they could not tear their eyes away. They had begun backing away slowly without realizing it. Be they lizard man warriors who had come in high spirits, or Zarusu and the others who had come here prepared to die, all of them were shocked to the core by the appearance of this unimaginably powerful entity. I know the King of Death didn't use his full strength on us, but even so, I didn't expect the warrior he sent to fight in earnest to be so frightening. Even with a spell that removed his fear, the impulse to run away still surged within Zariasu's heart. It was a miracle that the warriors, who were not protected by such magic, were not already trampling each other as they fled. Cocytus slowly drew closer. He strode proudly into the marsh past the skeletal army. And then Cocytus stopped, roughly 30 meters away from the lizard men. After that, his insectoid face swiveled atop his slender neck, as though looking for someone. Zarusu had the feeling that Cocytus's eyes were on him. All right, since Ain-sama is watching, I shall ensure you get chance to shine. However, before that, ice pillar. As the spell activated, 2 pillars of ice erupted from the water between the lizard men and Cocytus, about 20 meters apart. This might be rude to warriors who are ready to give their lives, but must inform you that my side of these pillars will be your grave. Any who cross it shall die. Cocytus folded his arms, as though to say, the choice is yours. Oh yeah, he doesn't look like it, but he's a pretty decent chap, isn't he? Zarusu nodded deeply at Zenberu's words. Then, he stepped forward. Zenberu and the other 2 chiefs followed him. Shazryu looked back at the warriors who were about to follow him. You should stay here. No, return to the village. Otherwise, You'll die with us. What? We want to fight too. It's scary, but even if it's scary, we still want to fight. Retreat is not cowardice. Living is true courage. Then, there's some of us who can't fall back either. Besides, as chiefs, we can't accept other people ruling us without a fight. No. We still want to fight, Chief. Hold on a second. Get out of here, young ones. This is a job for us old folks. The lizard men who shoved their way forward were all advanced in years, but none of them was old enough to be considered elderly. There were 57 of them, and none of the others could say anything after seeing their faces. Perhaps if they looked like they were resolved to die or had given up on themselves, they would have asked to come along. However, their expressions were a plea for the younger lizard men to live on and celebrate the miracle of life. With nothing left to say, the rest of the warriors turned back. Shazryu turned to face Cocytus once more. Sorry for the wait, Cocytus. Cocytus extended a hand to the lizard men and curled it towards him. Bring it, the gesture seemed to say. In response to this taunt, Shazryu shouted, Charge! Oh! Fully resolved to die, the lizard men gave voice to a cry from the depths of their souls, a roar which seemed to split the very sky, and rushed at Cocytus. Cocytus calmly regarded the warriors charging him. This might be bit disrespectful to warriors like you, but shall call your numbers. Cocytus was sure that he would not be defeated even if all of the warriors reached him, but still, he had to weed his opponents out. Personally speaking, Cocytus would have liked to allow his foes to reach a range where they could fight. However, he had received far more largesse than he deserved, and allowing this ragtag band of misfits to do battle with a guardian of the great underground tomb of Nazarick would be disrespectful to Ain-sama. Thus, he unleashed his aura. It was a skill derived from the Knight of Niflheim class, Frost Aura. This special ability damaged and slowed the foe through the use of extreme cold temperatures. At full power, it could even engulf the lizard men spectating from the sides. So he had to suppress its power. He had to narrow its radius and reduce its damage. This ought to do it. A wave of freezing cold expanded from Cocytus, instantly filling a radius of 25 meters across. The temperature plummeted upon exposure to the intense cold, and the very air seemed to groan. That ought to do. He drew back his aura. The momentary exposure meant that the savage blizzard like Snapfrost had vanished like it had never been. However, it was no illusion or trick of the senses. The best proof of that was the 57 lizard man corpses that covered the marsh. Only 5 more still remained. However, they were the 5 strongest lizard men. Unfazed by Cocytus's might or the deaths of their comrades, they moved out as one. A stone flew through the air. The armored lizard men led the charge, followed by 2 more behind it. In addition, the 2 swamp elementals had cracks all over them after the cold attack, and lagged behind the lizard men because they were slower. The one at the rear incanted spell after spell. The first strike was a stone, which was aimed at Cocytus's throat. However, it was completely meaningless because we, guardians, are equipped with items that resist ranged attacks. An invisible barrier which appeared to cover his body deflected the stone. It was followed by a charging lizard man. The armor he wore was an ancestral heirloom, one of the 4 treasures, the white dragon bone. It was strong enough to deflect frost pain, itself one of the 4 treasures, and it was hailed as the hardest armor among the lizard men. Facing it was a sword which Cocytus drew out of nothing, as though it had been sheathed in the air. The sword Cocytus unsheathed was an odachi, its blade over 180 centimeters long, named God-slaying/Emperor. It was the sharpest of the 21 weapons which Cocytus possessed. Then, he swung it at the incoming lizard man. The fluid cut whooshed quietly through the air. If not for the present situation, it would have been a sound which people would want to listen for. After that sound, the chief's body and his armor split into two halves from head to tail, which fell to the left and right into the marsh. God/Emperor was unscathed despite cleaving through the strongest armor of the lizard men. The other two lizard men did not seem affected by the death of their comrade. They raised their weapons and executed a pincer attack. Yard. On the right, Zenbaru sent a karate chop at Kokaitis' face, having enhanced it with iron natural weapon and iron skin. Guu. On the left was Frost Pain, stabbing at the belly. This attack was calculated to exploit the fact that long weapons were unwieldy in melee combat. Of course that only applied to regular people. Kokaitis shifted slightly and intercepted Zenbaru's arm with the blade of God Slaying/Emperor. His preternatural movements made it seem as though the weapon in his hand was an extension of his limbs. Zenbaru's skin could rival the hardness of steel under the effects of iron skin, but the armor from just now had already proven the sharpness of God Slaying/Emperor. The blade which entered Zenbaru's arm carved it off like it was going through water. Gore. As Zenbaru's severed right arm sprayed fresh arterial blood, Kokaitis' other hand casually gripped Frost Pain, which was headed at his belly. Oh, see, this is pretty good sword. Wah! Zarosu gave up on pulling back the immovable Frost Pain, and immediately lashed out at Kokaitis' knee with a kick. Kokaitis did not dodge it. He simply took the blow. In the end, when Zaryasu's foot connected with Kokaitis' knee, it was Zarosu who felt the pain. It felt just like kicking an iron wall with all his might. Over magic, mass-like cure wounds. Through the use of prodigious amounts of mana, one could forcibly cast a spell that should not have been normally usable. Aided by this meta-magic enhancement, Shaziryu cast a spell that healed everyone's wounds. Oh. Kokaitis looked at Shaziryu with interest as the latter used a meta-magic technique he had never heard of before. However, the two swamp elementals blocked his line of sight. While Zenbaru's arm gradually resumed its original form, the two swamp elementals attacked Kokaitis with their tentacles. However, Kokaitis had already slashed at the swamp elementals' bodies. Just as the swamp elementals dissolved into clumps of mud, Zarosu punched at Kokaitis' compound eyes, his belly, and his chest. Naturally, it was Zarosu who was hurt instead. The skin on his knuckles split and wept tears of fresh blood. How bothersome! Kokaitis swatted at Zaryasu's chest with his spiked tail. Gware! Zarosu flew into the distance like he had been hit by a baseball bat, accompanied by the sound of cracking. In the end, he hit the marsh, rolling several times before coming to a halt. However, the agony in his chest and the bright red blood he was coughing up made it hard for Zarosu to breathe. The broken ribs had probably pierced his lungs because he could not take air in no matter how hard he tried to breathe. It felt as though he were in water. The hot fluid pouring into his throat made him want to vomit. He looked down at his chest, and the wound which looked like someone had stabbed him with a sharp blade was gushing with blood. Just one hit had reduced Zarosu to this pitiful state. Zarosu glared at Kokaitis, the fighting spirit still burning in his eyes even as he struggled to keep breathing. So, you still wish to fight, then shall return this to you. After casually tossing Frost Pain back to the fallen Zarosu, Kokaitis ignored them and turned to the remaining lizard men. Shaziryu cast a healing spell on Zenbaru, who had regrown his arm, but whose health had been greatly depleted. Just as Kokaitis was about to reach them, another stone flew at him, attempting to divert his attention. However, the attack was useless, and was easily deflected. How annoying! Kokaitis grumbled, and then extended his hand at the small fang's chief. Piercing ICLE. Several dozen razor-sharp ickles, each the size of an arm, showered down on a large area. One of the lizard men was within the attack radius and the ickles pierced him instantly. He took one in the chest, two in the belly, and one in the right thigh. Each of them easily penetrated his body. The small Fang chief, the best ranger among the lizardmen, crumpled to the swamp like a puppet whose strings had been cut, where he expired. Over magic, mass light cure wounds. Zenbaru charged AEAD while Shaziryu cast a healing spell again. Zenbaru was trying to buy time for Zariasu's wounds to mend. He knew this was a reckless course of action, and that he was nothing before the might of Cocytus. Even so, Zenbaru sprinted AEAD without a moment's hesitation. Cocytus swung lightly at Zenbaru, who had entered his attack range. The swing was faster than Zenbaru could see. Its speed was beyond Zenbaru's dexterity. The blade sheared easily through Zenbaru's flesh. The decapitated corpse of Zenbaru spurted blood like a geyser as it collapsed gently to the marshlands. Shortly after that, his head joined it on the sod. Now, only the two of you are left. Had heard of your strength from Ain-sama, but in the end, only the two of you remained. Cocytus, who had not moved so much as an inch since the battle had started, studied the two of them, and flicked his sword. There was no trace of blood or fat on the gleaming white blade. That beautiful movement looked like it could sweep everything away in a single stroke. Facing it was Zarasu, who had recovered to the point where he could barely stand, and Shaziryu, who had drawn his great sword. The two of them flanked Cocytus front and rear. Zarasu dabbed his fingers in the blood flowing from his chest and smeared it on his face. The way he applied the blood to himself made it seem as though he was summoning the ancestral spirits down upon himself. Zarasu, how are your wounds? Not good. It's still aching. Still, I can take a few more swings. Really now? That should be enough, right? Frankly speaking, I'm almost out of mana. If I'm not careful, I might keel over. Shaziryu's teeth ground against each other. Perhaps he was laughing. As Zarasu heard this, his expression changed as well. Oh, really? Anya, you're pushing yourself pretty hard too. Zarasu smiled, and then he sighed, relaxing his shoulders. His sword arm sagged. A torrent of pain erupted from near his chest, but Zarasu fought to ignore it. He would not give up until the last moment. Zarasu intended to fight until the end. From the beginning, he had known full well that victory was impossible. Defeat was unavoidable, yet they could not accept it. That was because it would be like lying to countless people, telling them that they could win. Since others had actually believed them, they could not accept the fact that they would be defeated. They had to give everything they had until the final moment. Then swing that sword you're wielding. Zariasu's cry echoed throughout the surrounding area. The sound of clacking came from Cocytus's mandibles. Fine. Cry. Cocytus was probably laughing. But this was not the laughter of the strong mocking the weak, but a warrior laughing with a fellow fighter. Very well, Zarasu. That's it, then. I'll fight with you to the bitter end as well. Shaziryu smiled as well. Then. Sorry to keep you waiting, Cocytus Dono. Cocytus shrugged as Shaziryu said this. It is fine. Am not so thoughtless as to interrupt. Farewell. Between brothers. Now, prepare to meet your fate. No, pardon me. You were ready for it from the start. As Zarasu and Shaziryu began moving, Cocytus flourished God-slaying/Emperor and asked, State your names. Shaziryu Shasha, Zarasu Shasha. Will remember you, warriors. Also, apologize. AEAD of time for not using the weapons in all my hands. It is not that wish to scorn you, but you are simply not strong enough to warrant their use. What a shame. Indeed, here I come. The two of them lunged at Cocytus, splashing across the marsh. The uncoordinated timing of their attacks baffled Cocytus. The two of them did not enter his range at the same time. Shaziryu was the first to do so. Sensing a scheme, Cocytus awaited their next move. Since Shaziryu was the first to enter his strike zone, Cocytus carefully studied Shaziryu's next move. Shaziryu stopped just before Cocytus could reach him, and earthbind, and cast a spell. Countless chains formed of mud leapt at Cocytus, and Zarusu broke into a wild sprint. He had even hidden frost pain behind his back so his opponent would not be able to gauge his attack range. Shaziryu's declaration that, "I'm almost out of mana," was merely a ruse to deceive Cocytus. If he had taken the bait, perhaps he might have been bound by the mystic chains and been hit by Zarusu's charge from behind. However tough their opponent's exoskeleton was, he should still be able to break through if he poured all his strength into the edge. With that in mind, Zarusu had abandoned defense to focus on the attack, and the resulting strike should have been quite strong. He seems quite confident in his sword. Cocytus could understand how he felt, because much like him, Cocytus felt strongly about the weapons he owned. In particular, the sword he now wielded, which had once been used by his creator, was especially significant to him. Therefore, despite how lopsided it would make the battle, Cocytus insisted on doing battle with God-slaying/Emperor in hand, as a sign of his supreme respect. However, they had made a miscalculation, which was that their opponent was Cocytus, guardian of the 5th floor of the great underground tomb of Nazareth. My defenses cannot be breached by someone whose level is below mine. The chains of mud rebounded off Cocytus an instant before they reached him, reverting to regular dirt and sinking back into the mire. Low-tier spells could not pierce Cocytus's magical defenses. Icy burst. As the shout rang out, a vortex of ivory fog swirled out and surrounded Cocytus. A futile effort. Cocytus was immune to cold damage, so as the gentle breeze of the supercold mist blew around him, he patiently waited for Zarusu and Shaziryu to enter his attack range. Soon enough, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. However, Cocytus hesitated briefly. He thought, can my foe be stopped just by cutting off his head? In the face of Zarusu's full attack, Cocytus did not think that mere decapitation would stop his advance. The mental image of a headless body rushing him appeared in his mind. In that case, he ought to chop his hands off first, and then his head. No, that wouldn't be clean enough. Best to finish him off in one stroke. Zarusu charged with all his strength, devoting every fiber of his being to the attack, but he was still too slow for Cocytus. A black shadow appeared amidst the white mist. Zarusu thrust his sword, and Cocytus caught it lightly between his fingers, like before. Cocytus did not feel any cold from his fingertips. Perhaps Zarusu knew that Cocytus was immune to the cold and did not use the ability. The charge was fast, but he had blocked it easily. That puzzled Cocytus. However, those doubts faded in an instant. His foe's life would end with a swing of God-slaying/Emperor, so there was nothing more to think about. And then there would only be one of them left. So it was just an unplanned charge then. Just as a somewhat disappointed Cocytus was about to strike, he changed his mind. Oh! With a mighty roar, the great sword hacked down through the freezing mist which hung in the air. Shaziryu's swing carried a gale in its wake, which dispersed the frozen fog. The earthbind, Zarusu's charge, icy burst, all of them were decoys. While he had to be wary of Zarusu stabbing him with frost pain, Shaziryu's overhead chop with the great sword was more damaging, so that must have been their true intention. However, surprise attacks ought to be conducted in silence. As long as they could not erase the sound they made as they ran across the marsh, it could not truly qualify as an unexpected attack. Cocytus was puzzled. Was this really worth taking cold damage? Or was it just a meaningless struggle? Still, it was true that his foe had entered his strike zone. Now that Zariasu's weapon was within his grasp, there was nothing to fear from him. Only the order in which they died would change. Having decided that, Cocytus swung God-slaying/Emperor. It struck. Shasryu was cloven in half along with his great sword. Before the body could hit the ground, Cocytus withdrew his blade, planning to attack Zarasu. And then, the fingers grasping Frostpain slipped. Surprised, Cocytus looked at his fingers to see what had made it slide forward. He saw the bright red of blood amidst the white mist hanging in the air. In an instant, Cocytus realized why his fingers had slipped. Blood? He was confused. He wondered when it had gotten there, and then as he saw Zariasu's face through the mist, it suddenly dawned on him. The blood smeared on his face was not to paint himself but to coat his sword. Neither had the icy burst been intended to hurt Cocytus or conceal Shasryu's form. Its purpose had been to hide the blood coating the sword. So was keeping it behind his back. When he blocked Zariasu's attack, Cocytus had done so with his fingers. Zarasu remembered it, and had bet on the slim chance that he would do it again. Thus he had gone to these lengths to set up the battlefield to pull it off. Just then, a flash of lightning surged through Cocytus's brain. So that was why his thrust felt so weak. No wonder. There's no way the plan to lubricate the sword with blood so it could pierce through would work every time. In order to create this chance, he slowed his strike to make me think it was easy to catch. The blade slowly slid over, inching towards Cocytus's pale blue body. Now that Zarasu had thrown his full strength and even body weight into the thrust, not even Cocytus could stop it, not with two blood-stained fingers. If he had grasped it further away from him, there might be something else he could do. But at this short range, he was out of options. Cocytus was so moved that he trembled. While it had relied on a bit of luck, this was an attack which had required multiple gambles, each of which had paid off. The most important thing was that without Shasryu, none of this would have been possible. Shasryu should not have understood Zariasu's gambit, but as an elder brother, he had placed all his trust in his younger brother, to the point of sacrificing his own life. That pointless surprise attack and shouting were all to divert Cocytus's attention from his brother for just a moment. A single moment. And for just a single moment as Zarasu was forcing Frostpain at him with all his might, Cocytus's mandibles trembled. Truly marvelous. And so the blade struck Cocytus's body only to deflect lightly off. His body, which glowed a faint blue, did not have so much as a scratch on it. This was the result of the impassable gulf that separated the highest level NPCs of Nazarick from mere lizard men. Forgive me, but possess skill, which, briefly, negates weakly enchanted weapon attacks. Once I activate it, your attack is useless. That blow had been well struck, and Cocytus felt that leaving a scar as a mark of respect for these warriors would be appropriate. However, he was under the eyes of a supreme being, and he could not do so in his position as a guardian. Cocytus deliberately took one step back, splashing up the mud and staying his beautiful blue body. It was just a single step. There was no meaning to it. Backing up would not have made any difference to him. Zarasu would still die, and Cocytus would still win. However, that step back was a sign of praise from the strong Cocytus to the weak Zarasu. Zarasu smiled, in the way someone did when he knew full well what sort of fate was in store for him, yet ran towards it anyway. As he did, Cocytus swung his sword down.